In the spring of 1869, a startling find was made by demolition workers as they began taking down the abandoned Blessed Widows Christian home on Manhattan's East 42nd Street. Hidden behind a false basement wall were 52 wooden coffins, lined up in meticulous rows, each holding the remains of an elderly woman. This discovery would cast a long shadow over New York City for generations to come. These were no ordinary burials. Every skeleton was adorned with costly jewelry, and next to each coffin rested a handwritten ledger entry, detailing the woman's net worth down to the last penny. The most unnerving realization came when investigators checked official records. Not one of these 52 women had ever been recorded as dying at the institution. They had simply disappeared from existence. For 22 years, this establishment had been celebrated as Manhattan's most reputable charity for impoverished widows, earning praise from newspapers and endorsements from prominent churches throughout the city. Yet somehow, every wealthy widow who crossed its threshold had first transferred her entire fortune to the institution before vanishing without any trace. Before we reveal the terrible truth about these 52 missing souls, if you have the courage to hear tales most would prefer to forget, hit that subscribe button now. This channel isn't designed for everyone, it's meant only for those willing to explore America's darkest historical chapters. And drop a comment telling us, which state are you listening from? We're curious to know where our fearless community of mystery enthusiasts is located. What made this discovery even more unsettling was how the investigation would uncover a meticulously planned system of murder that had been operating right under everyone's noses, blessed by the church and celebrated by high society for more than 20 years. The killer's techniques were so polished, so perfectly concealed behind Christian kindness, that even the most doubtful individuals never questioned what was happening behind those inviting doors. Back in the 1840s, Manhattan presented striking contrasts that would set the stage for one of America's most evil crimes. While wealthy citizens constructed grand mansions along Fifth Avenue, their marble fronts catching the afternoon light, thousands of immigrants were packed into tenements stretching from the Bowery to the Hudson River like an ocean of human despair. The very air reflected this inequality, fresh and clean in the uptown neighborhoods, but heavy with coal smoke and the smell of unwashed humanity downtown, where hope came to die. Elderly widows were among the most defenseless, women who had lost their husbands and found themselves isolated in a harsh city with minimal family support and even fewer legal rights. The law provided them with no protection. A woman's property automatically became her husband's upon marriage, and widowhood frequently meant destitution, no matter how comfortable their married existence had been. Many discovered that their deceased husband's business partners or relatives had already taken what they believed would be their inheritance, leaving them with nothing but memories and whatever clothing they wore. It was into this environment of female vulnerability that Margaret O'Brien arrived in 1845, claiming to offer deliverance. The Blessed Widows Christian home occupied 127 East 42nd Street, a three-story brownstone converted from a private mansion with careful attention to creating an atmosphere of security and dignity. The building's front was painted a warm cream color that beautifully captured the morning sunlight, with black shutters that remained in perfect condition and window boxes displaying seasonal flowers that changed with clockwork regularity. A brass plaque next to the substantial oak door simply announced, Blessed Widows Christian Home, founded 1845, a refuge for God's forgotten daughters. Margaret O'Brien possessed a commanding presence and instinctively knew how to project exactly the image that would generate confidence. At 40, when she established the home, she stood tall without being threatening, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a manner suggesting both devotion and capability. Her clothing was consistently fine quality without being flashy, dark colors conveying respectability, fabrics hinting at comfort without screaming excess. Her eyes were probably her most striking feature, pale, blue, and sharp. They could express maternal warmth during public appearances and absolute control in private discussions. O'Brien represented herself as an Irish immigrant who had reached New York in 1839 carrying excellent references from Catholic charities in Boston. She spoke with just enough accent to seem genuine, but not so much as to sound foreign or unsophisticated. Her personal history, which she revealed selectively and always with suitable emotion, described a comfortable upbringing in County Cork, marriage to a prosperous merchant who died young from consumption, and a divine calling to serve God by looking after other women who had endured similar bereavements. She had joined forces with two individuals whose abilities perfectly matched her own. Catherine Kelly served as the institution's head caretaker and medical attendant. Kelly was a petite, lively woman in her mid-30s with graying brown hair and hands perpetually occupied with mending, cleaning, measuring medicines, or recording thorough observations about each resident's condition. She navigated the building like someone who knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the windows, every sound indicating something wrong. Her credentials, based on the references she offered, included nursing training at Massachusetts General Hospital and experience tending elderly patients in private residences throughout New England. Father Patrick Walsh rounded out their group as the institution's chaplain and spiritual guide. Walsh was young for a priest, barely 30, with dark hair that curled slightly despite his attempts to keep it severely styled, and brown eyes that appeared to hold authentic compassion for human suffering. He was attractive in a way that made elderly women want to nurture him, and younger women momentarily forget propriety. Yet he conducted himself with the suitable dignity of his vocation. His voice was his finest tool, deep, warm, and perfectly tuned for both personal counseling sessions and formal preaching. Together, they had established what seemed like an ideal Christian charity. The home's mission statement, engraved on a bronze plaque in the entryway, read, "To provide loving Christian care for widowed women of good character who find themselves without family support in their twilight years, that they might live their remaining days in dignity, surrounded by sisters in faith, and pass into eternal rest with the comfort of knowing they have been loved." The institution functioned on a sliding scale that appeared both sensible and caring. Wealthy widows could contribute their savings as an admission fee, securing private quarters on the second floor and receiving what O'Brien termed premium care, private nursing when necessary, special meals accommodating dietary restrictions, and help with personal correspondence and financial matters. Women with fewer resources could earn their stay by working in the home's kitchen, laundry, or garden, sharing rooms on the third floor while participating equally in all social and religious activities. The building itself had been remodeled with careful consideration for creating a homelike rather than institutional atmosphere. The entrance hall featured polished mahogany woodwork and wallpaper in gentle floral patterns suggesting a well-kept private residence. A substantial oil painting of Christ blessing children dominated one wall, while the opposite wall displayed framed photographs of previous residents who had graduated to their eternal reward, as O'Brien delicately expressed it. The ground floor contained the common areas where residents spent most of their time. The sitting room was furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in small conversational groupings, tables for card games or needlework, and shelves filled with books, newspapers, and religious materials. Large windows overlooked the garden, providing daylight and views of the meticulously maintained flower beds that several residents tended as their contribution to the home's operation. The dining room could seat all 30 residents comfortably at 3 long tables covered with crisp white linen. Each place setting included proper china and silverware, small details reinforcing the home's dedication to preserving dignity and respectability. Meals were served at exact times, breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, and supper at 6 o'clock, with residents required to dress appropriately and observe correct etiquette. The kitchen was Catherine Kelly's territory, where she supervised meal preparation with help from several residents working to cover their expenses. The kitchen was up to date for its era, featuring a large coal stove, multiple work surfaces, and a pantry stocked with quality provisions. Kelly insisted on fresh vegetables from the garden when available, and arranged with local merchants for meat, dairy, and other necessities. The second floor contained the private rooms for premium residents, each furnished with a bed, wardrobe, writing desk, and comfortable chair. These rooms were decorated individually to reflect their occupants' preferences, with residents encouraged to bring personal items and family photographs to make the space feel like home. A small library at the end of the hall provided additional reading material and a quiet space for private contemplation. The third floor housed shared rooms for residents who contributed labor rather than money, along with staff quarters. While less luxurious than the private accommodations below, these rooms were clean, comfortable, and decorated with the same attention to detail characterizing the rest of the building. But perhaps the most significant space in the entire building was the chapel O'Brien had created in what had originally been the mansion's ballroom. The chapel was a lovely space with vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows depicting scenes from Christ's life, and wooden pews accommodating all residents comfortably. The altar was simple yet elegant, topped with a marble cross and flanked by fresh flower arrangements that residents took turns providing from the garden. Each morning began with communal prayers in this chapel at precisely 6:30. Father Walsh conducted daily Mass for Catholic residents while offering non-denominational services for the Protestant women. His sermons highlighted themes deeply resonant with women who had experienced profound loss: the Christian virtues of charity and forgiveness, the importance of accepting God's will even amid suffering, and the spiritual advantages of releasing attachment to worldly possessions in preparation for eternal life. The daily schedule was organized but not oppressive, designed to provide the comfort of predictability while accommodating individual preferences and needs. After morning prayers and breakfast, residents could choose how to spend their time. Many gathered in the sitting room for conversation or needlework, creating quilts, clothing repairs, or decorative items sold at local markets to raise funds for the home's operation. The garden behind the building offered another popular activity, particularly during warmer months. Residents could tend flower beds, grow vegetables for the kitchen, or simply sit in the shade enjoying relative quiet compared to the busy streets beyond the walls. The garden was enclosed by a high brick wall providing privacy and security, with gates kept locked except during designated outdoor periods. Reading was encouraged, with residents having access to both religious texts and secular literature. O'Brien maintained subscriptions to several newspapers and magazines, ensuring women could stay informed about current events. She frequently led discussions about news articles during evening gatherings, encouraging residents to share their opinions and experiences related to the day's topics. Evening meals were particularly important social occasions where residents shared stories of their past lives, discussed hopes and concerns, and formed friendships, making the home feel like genuine community. O'Brien often joined these meals, inquiring about each woman's day and noting any concerns or needs requiring attention. What made the Blessed Widows Christian Home especially appealing to potential residents was its reputation for personalized care and authentic respect for each woman's dignity. Unlike the city's overcrowded poorhouses where elderly women were warehoused in grim conditions with minimal care, or the expensive private arrangements many widows couldn't afford, the home offered a middle path seeming both practical and compassionate. The staff-to-resident ratio was unusually generous, one staff member for every 6 residents, allowing personal attention to each woman's needs, whether medical, spiritual, or simply emotional. Catherine Kelly maintained detailed records of each resident's health status, medications, dietary requirements, and personal preferences. Father Walsh made himself available for private counseling sessions, offering spiritual guidance and emotional support to women struggling with grief, loneliness, or anxiety about their futures. Most importantly, the home had built a reputation for helping residents navigate the complex legal and financial challenges many elderly widows encountered. O'Brien herself was well versed in matters of inheritance law, property rights, and estate planning. She frequently assisted residents in organizing their affairs, contacting lawyers to draft or update wills, and ensuring their final wishes would be properly executed. This help with legal matters had become one of the home's most valued services. Many women arrived with their financial affairs in disarray, uncertain of their rights or unclear about protecting their interests. O'Brien's guidance helped them understand their options and make informed decisions about managing their remaining resources. The home's reputation for this type of assistance spread throughout New York's community of elderly women, generating a steady stream of referrals from former residents, family members, and even legal professionals who had worked with O'Brien. Lawyers throughout the city knew they could recommend the Blessed Widows Christian Home to clients needing both housing and help managing their affairs. On the morning of November 15, 1847, a chilly autumn wind rattled the windows of the Blessed Widows Christian Home as residents assembled for their customary morning prayers. The chapel filled with the soft rustle of woolen garments and quiet conversation murmurs as women settled into their usual pews. But when 6:30 arrived and Father Walsh took his place at the altar, an immediate sense that something was wrong descended on the assembled congregation. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was absent from her customary front pew. Eleanor Whitmore was a creature of absolute routine. In the 6 months since her arrival at the home, she had never once been late for morning prayers, never missed a meal, never deviated from her carefully structured daily schedule. At 73 years old, she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that order and punctuality formed the foundations of a life well lived. Her silver hair was always arranged in the same elegant style, her clothing always pressed and properly arranged, her posture always erect despite her age. Mrs. Whitmore had appeared perfectly healthy just the day before, participating actively in the afternoon's needlework circle, where she had entertained other residents with stories from her late husband's successful shipping business. She had discussed plans to write letters to distant relatives in Philadelphia, expressing particular excitement about corresponding with a grandniece recently engaged. During the evening meal, she had been in especially good spirits, sharing memories of past Christmas celebrations and asking Catherine Kelly about the home's plans for the upcoming holiday season. As minutes passed and Mrs. Whitmore's absence became undeniable, Catherine Kelly rose from her usual seat near the back of the chapel. Kelly's normally composed demeanor showed signs of strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron, and her usually efficient movement seemed hesitant and uncertain. When she reached the front of the chapel, she turned to face the assembled women with tears streaming down her face. "Dear sisters," she began, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine grief, "I must share heartbreaking news with you all. Our beloved Mrs. Whitmore passed peacefully in her sleep during the night. Father Walsh was able to provide last rites, and she spoke of how grateful she was to have found such a loving family here with all of us. Her final words were about how blessed she felt to have spent her last month surrounded by such faithful Christian women." The announcement sent a shock wave through the chapel that was almost physical in its intensity. Several women gasped audibly. Others began weeping, and the murmur of distressed voices created a buzz of confusion and grief. Mrs. Whitmore had shown no signs of illness, no indication death was approaching. She had been laughing during dinner the previous evening, sharing stories with enthusiasm and appetite. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, an intelligent 68-year-old who had been at the home for nearly 2 years, felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she absorbed Kelly's announcement. Something felt profoundly wrong about the entire situation, though she couldn't immediately identify what was troubling her beyond the obvious shock of sudden death. Father Walsh stepped forward to offer spiritual comfort to the distressed women. His rich voice providing the familiar cadences of prayer and scripture that usually brought peace during sorrowful times. He spoke about the unpredictability of God's calling, the blessing of a peaceful death, and the Christian hope of resurrection and eternal life. His words were appropriate and comforting. Yet Mrs. Brennan found herself studying his face rather than absorbing his message. There was something in his expression, a subtle lack of genuine surprise or grief that struck her as inconsistent with the sudden loss of a beloved resident. But what struck Mrs. Brennan as particularly strange was the speed with which everything had been arranged. By noon that same day, Mrs. Whitmore's body had already been removed from the building by undertakers, and Margaret O'Brien announced she had been buried in a simple ceremony at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, according to what she claimed were the deceased woman's final wishes. Mrs. Whitmore had expressed to me just last week her desire for a simple burial without fuss or ceremony, O'Brien explained to the gathered residents during the midday meal. She was quite specific about wanting to be laid to rest quickly and quietly without burdening her new family here with prolonged mourning. She felt excessive grief was selfish and that we should celebrate her transition to eternal peace rather than dwelling on our own sense of loss. This explanation, while presented with O'Brien's usual authority and compassion, raised several troubling questions in Mrs. Brennan's mind. In all her months of friendship with Mrs. Whitmore, the deceased woman had never mentioned any preference for quick burial or simple ceremonies. Quite the opposite, she had often spoken about the elaborate funeral her husband had received, describing it with obvious pride and affection as a proper celebration of a life well lived. Mrs. Brennan's unease deepened when she attempted to pay respects at Mrs. Whitmore's grave site. When she approached O'Brien with this request, the director's response was gentle but firmly discouraging. "I understand your desire to honor Mrs. Whitmore's memory, dear," O'Brien said, placing a maternal hand on Mrs. Brennan's shoulder, "but her family, relatives from Philadelphia who arrived yesterday to make arrangements, have specifically requested privacy during this difficult time. They felt visits from non-family members might prolong their grief and prevent them from accepting God's will in this matter." The mention of family members came as a complete surprise to Mrs. Brennan. In 6 months of close friendship with Mrs. Whitmore, she had never heard any mention of relatives in Philadelphia beyond the grandniece with whom she corresponded occasionally. Mrs. Whitmore had consistently presented herself as a woman largely alone in the world, with only distant connections to family members she rarely saw. The mystery deepened further when Mrs. Brennan discovered that Mrs. Whitmore's personal belongings had also disappeared with remarkable efficiency. The ornate jewelry box that had held several valuable pieces inherited from her mother, the leather-bound journal where she had written daily entries about her experiences at the home, the collection of photographs and letters she had treasured as her last connections to her previous life, all had vanished from her room. When Mrs. Brennan inquired about these items, Catherine Kelly provided an explanation consistent with the story about the mysterious Philadelphia relatives, but no less troubling for its consistency. Everything was packed and sent to the family according to Mrs. Whitmore's written instructions, Kelly explained, her tone suggesting such questions were slightly inappropriate. She had prepared very detailed directions about the disposition of her belongings, wanting to ensure nothing would be wasted or forgotten. It's really quite touching how thoroughly she planned for her departure from this world. But Mrs. Brennan knew Mrs. Whitmore had been working on organizing her belongings just days before her death, and the elderly woman had mentioned wanting to give several pieces of jewelry to fellow residents as remembrances. She had specifically discussed her intention to leave her pearl brooch to Mrs. Brennan herself, as a token of their friendship. Over the following weeks, as life at the home settled back into usual routines, Mrs. Brennan began noticing other troubling patterns she had previously overlooked or dismissed as coincidence. Mrs. Whitmore had not been the first resident to die suddenly and be buried with unusual haste. In the 2 years since Mrs. Brennan's arrival, 5 other women had passed away under remarkably similar circumstances. There had been Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, a 70-year-old widow who had arrived with a substantial inheritance from her husband's textile business. Mrs. Morrison had died suddenly in February 1846, just 4 months after her arrival, on a night when she had seemed perfectly healthy. Like Mrs. Whitmore, she had been buried quickly in a private ceremony excluding the other residents. Mrs. Ruth Patterson had followed in August 1846, another wealthy widow who had contributed a significant entrance fee and died unexpectedly during sleep. Mrs. Catherine Donnelly in January 1847, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan in June 1847, and Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes in September 1847, all following the same pattern of sudden nighttime death and immediate burial. The most unsettling realization came when Mrs. Brennan attempted to verify these deaths with local newspapers. Despite the prominent status many of these women had held in New York society, Mrs. Morrison had been well known in textile circles, Mrs. Patterson active in charitable organizations, Mrs. Donnelly married to a successful merchant. Not a single obituary had appeared in any publication. It was as if these women had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only their wealth and empty beds. Mrs. Brennan's growing suspicions received unexpected confirmation when she encountered Mrs. Morrison's former housekeeper, Mary O'Sullivan, at the local market. O'Sullivan had served the Morrison household for over 15 years and was devastated to learn her former employer had died months earlier without her knowledge. Mrs. Morrison always said she'd send for me if she ever got sick, O'Sullivan confided to Mrs. Brennan over cups of tea in a nearby shop. She treated me like family, and I can't understand why no one notified me about her passing. I've been wondering why I never heard from her after she moved to that home. She promised to write every week, but I never received a single letter. This conversation revealed another disturbing pattern. None of the deceased women had maintained contact with their previous lives after entering the home. Servants, acquaintances, business associates, and distant family members had all been left wondering about the sudden silence from women who had previously been reliable correspondents. As winter settled over Manhattan in early 1848, the atmosphere within the blessed widow's Christian home began to change in ways subtle but unmistakable to someone paying close attention. Mrs. Sarah Brennan found herself observing daily routines with new eyes, noting patterns of behavior she had previously accepted without question. The change was not immediately obvious to casual observation. The home continued operating with its usual efficiency and apparent compassion. Meals were served punctually. Religious services maintained their comforting rhythm, and staff continued demonstrating the same attentive care that had built the institution's sterling reputation. But beneath this surface normality, Mrs. Brennan began detecting currents of calculation and manipulation that chilled her to the bone. She noticed Margaret O'Brien had developed a particular talent for identifying and cultivating relationships with residents possessing substantial financial resources. During what appeared casual conversations over meals or in the sitting room, O'Brien would skillfully guide discussions toward topics of family relationships, financial planning, and personal history. Her questions seemed motivated by genuine interest in each woman's welfare, but Mrs. Brennan began recognizing a pattern in the information O'Brien sought to gather. "It must be such a comfort knowing your late husband provided so well for your future," O'Brien might say to a new resident. "Have you had an opportunity to organize your affairs since his passing? I find many widows struggle with the complexities of inheritance law and property management." These conversations often led to offers of assistance that seemed both practical and generous. O'Brien frequently recommended lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who could help residents navigate legal and financial challenges many elderly widows faced. She spoke knowledgeably about estate planning, inheritance taxes, and the importance of ensuring one's final wishes would be properly executed. "It brings such peace of mind," O'Brien would say, her voice filled with apparent sincerity, "to know that everything we've worked for will continue serving God's children even after we're called home to heaven. The women who have chosen to remember our home in their wills have found such comfort in that decision. They know their earthly possessions will be used to provide the same loving care for other widows needing our help." Father Walsh too had developed a sophisticated approach to spiritual counseling that seemed designed to encourage specific attitudes toward material possessions and earthly attachments. Residents meeting with him privately often emerged speaking about the vanity of worldly goods and the spiritual benefits of charitable giving. His counseling sessions frequently focused on biblical passages about the difficulty of the wealthy entering the kingdom of heaven and the blessedness of those who gave everything to follow Christ. "Our Lord himself taught us that we cannot serve both God and money," Father Walsh would explain during sermons. "The accumulation of earthly treasures often becomes a barrier to spiritual growth, a chain binding us to this world when we should be preparing our hearts for the next. True Christian charity requires us to release our attachment to material things and trust in God's providence for our needs." These theological discussions were presented with such apparent sincerity and backed by such extensive biblical knowledge that even skeptical residents found themselves influenced by Walsh's arguments. His youth and obvious intelligence made his words particularly persuasive, especially to elderly women raised to respect clerical authority and defer to religious guidance. Catherine Kelly's role in the operation was more subtle, but equally important. As the home's medical attendant, she maintained detailed records of each resident's health status, dietary needs, and medication requirements. Her nursing background allowed her to present herself as an expert in health and wellness matters, and her recommendations carried considerable weight with residents who valued her apparent competence and caring attention. Kelly had developed particular expertise in identifying residents suffering from insomnia, anxiety, or other conditions addressable with laudanum, a common medication readily available and widely prescribed for various ailments. Her treatment protocols often involved gradually increasing dosages over time, ostensibly to maintain effectiveness as patients develop tolerance to the drug. Many elderly women find their usual sleep patterns change as they age, Kelly would explain to residents mentioning difficulty sleeping. "It's quite normal and there's no reason to suffer unnecessarily when we have safe and effective remedies available. A small dose of laudanum before bedtime can help restore the natural rest your body needs to maintain good health." Mrs. Brennan's growing awareness of these patterns was crystallized by a conversation she overheard in late February 1848. Unable to sleep due to arthritis pain plaguing her during cold weather, she had risen from bed around midnight to walk the home's corridors, gentle exercise usually helping ease discomfort and tire her enough to return to sleep. As she moved quietly through the building's darkened hallways, she noticed light coming from beneath Margaret O'Brien's office door on the ground floor. Curious about who might be working so late and concerned someone might need assistance, she approached the door intending to offer help. The door was slightly ajar, and through the opening she could see O'Brien seated at her desk with Catherine Kelly and Father Walsh gathered around her. The desk was covered with what appeared legal documents, small medication bottles, and a leather ledger O'Brien was writing in with careful precision. A small bag of coin sat to one side, an occasional metallic clinking suggested it contained a substantial amount of money. The conversation she overheard froze her blood. The new resident, Mrs. Patterson mentioned her late husband's shipping investments again today, O'Brien was saying as she made ledger notes. Catherine's assessment suggests she's worth at least $15,000, possibly significantly more. She has no children, no close family she's mentioned beyond a nephew in Boston she sees perhaps once every few years. Father Walsh nodded thoughtfully. She's been attending my counseling sessions regularly, and I believe she could be guided toward the proper spiritual perspective on material attachments. She's quite devout, very susceptible to discussions about Christian charity and eternal rewards. Her guilt about her comfortable circumstances while others suffer could be channeled toward generous charitable giving. Excellent, O'Brien replied, making additional notes. But we must be patient with the timeline. Too many transitions in a short period would raise questions we cannot afford to answer. Mrs. Henderson has only been gone for 6 weeks, and Mrs. Whitmore's departure was just 3 months ago. We should wait at least another month before beginning the formal process with Mrs. Patterson. Kelly consulted a small notebook filled with her careful handwriting. Mrs. Patterson has already begun taking laudanum for her sleep difficulties, though she doesn't realize that's what I've been giving her. I've told her it's a special herbal preparation I make myself. Her tolerance is building nicely and she's already comfortable with taking medication before bedtime. When the time comes, increasing the dosage will be simple and unsuspicious. What about the legal preparations? Walsh asked. O'Brien smiled with satisfaction as she referenced another document. I've already begun discussing estate planning with her during casual conversations. She's expressed concern about her nephew's gambling habits and mentioned wanting to ensure her money goes to worthy causes rather than being wasted on his debts. Suggesting she leave everything to our home as a charitable legacy will seem like a natural solution to her concerns. Mrs. Brennan felt her knees weaken as the conversation's full implication became clear. These people were planning Mrs. Patterson's death, discussing it with the casual efficiency of merchants planning routine business transactions. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Whitmore had not died natural deaths. They had been murdered, killed for their money by the very people they had trusted to care for them. But even more horrifying was the realization this was not a crime of opportunity or passion, but a systematic operation running for months or possibly years. The careful planning, the patient cultivation of trust, the methodical approach to legal and medical preparation, all indicated a level of premeditation making the crimes infinitely more chilling. Backing away from the door as quietly as possible, Mrs. Brennan returned to her room with mind racing and heart pounding. Sleep was impossible as she tried processing what she had learned and deciding what, if anything, she could do to stop the next murder. The weeks following Mrs. Brennan's horrifying discovery became a period of careful investigation conducted under the most dangerous possible circumstances. She knew any obvious signs of suspicion or investigation would likely result in her becoming the next victim. Yet she also knew she could not stand by and allow Mrs. Patterson or other residents to be murdered without attempting to stop the killings. Her first priority was learning more about the true backgrounds of the 3 people running the home. If they were capable of systematic murder, she reasoned, they were certainly capable of lying about their identities and qualifications. Using her weekly trips to the local market as opportunities for discreet investigation, she began asking careful questions of merchants, neighbors, and anyone else who might have information about the home's staff. Her breakthrough came when she encountered Mr. Timothy Flanagan, the elderly clerk at St. Patrick's Cathedral who maintained records of all priests assigned to serve in the archdiocese. During a conversation about the spiritual comfort Father Walsh provided to residents, Flanagan's response revealed a disturbing inconsistency. "Father Walsh, you say?" Flanagan asked, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name among our priests. Could you perhaps be thinking of Father William Walsh from St. Mary's? He's been serving that parish for nearly 20 years, but he's much older than the man you're describing." When Mrs. Brennan provided a more detailed description of their chaplain, Flanagan became even more puzzled. "No, I'm quite certain we have no Father Patrick Walsh in the archdiocese. And from what you're telling me about his age and appearance, I would surely remember him if he had been ordained here. Perhaps he's visiting from another diocese." This conversation prompted Mrs. Brennan to pay closer attention to Father Walsh's behavior during religious services. She noticed that while his sermons were eloquent and his biblical knowledge impressive, he occasionally stumbled over Latin phrases during Mass in ways suggesting he was reading from a text rather than reciting familiar prayers from memory. His pronunciation of certain Latin words was also inconsistent, sometimes correct, sometimes revealing uncertainty inconsistent with proper priestly training. Most damning of all was an evening when she observed him alone in the chapel, apparently practicing his Latin pronunciation from a small book. She watched through a crack in the door as he repeated the same prayer multiple times, consulting the book frequently and moving his lips silently as if memorizing unfamiliar words. Her investigation into Catherine Kelly's background proved equally revealing. Through conversations with Mary O'Sullivan, Mrs. Morrison's former housekeeper, she learned about Kelly's supposed nursing experience at Massachusetts General Hospital. O'Sullivan's brother worked as a porter at that institution, and when asked about Kelly, he had no memory of anyone by that name working there during the period she claimed to have served. "My brother Patrick knows all the nurses who've worked at the hospital over the past 10 years, O'Sullivan confided. "He says there's never been a Catherine Kelly in their employ." "Are you sure that's where she said she worked?" Mrs. Brennan's most disturbing discovery came when she managed to gain access to O'Brien's office during the director's absence for a meeting with potential benefactors. The office was normally kept locked, but Mrs. Brennan had observed Kelly entering with a key on a ring attached to her belt. When Kelly was occupied with laundry duties in the basement, Mrs. Brennan used a hairpin to pick the simple lock, a skill she had learned as a child from her mischievous brother. Inside the office, she found evidence confirming her worst fears and revealing the true scope of crimes committed at the home. Hidden behind a false panel in the desk drawer, a hiding place she discovered purely by accident when the drawer stuck and she had to manipulate it to close properly, she found a collection of documents painting a picture of systematic fraud and murder spanning multiple years. The documents included copies of wills, all leaving substantial estates to the Blessed Widows Christian Home, signed by women who had supposedly died natural deaths. But more horrifying still was a detailed ledger listing each deceased resident by name, date of death, exact estate value transferred to the home, and brief notes about the method used to secure their cooperation. The ledger revealed that in just 3 years of operation, the home had acquired over $300,000 through the deaths of 21 women, far more than Mrs. Brennan had suspected. Each entry included notes about the woman's family situation, her estimated wealth, and the approach used to convince her to change her will. Some entries contained phrases making Mrs. Brennan's blood run cold. Laudanum increased gradually over 6 weeks. Documents signed while heavily sedated. Death occurred as planned. Burial arranged within 8 hours. No family inquiries received. But the most terrifying discovery came when Mrs. Brennan found a second ledger appearing to contain future plans. Mrs. Patterson's name was listed with an estimated date for her transition just 6 weeks away and projected inheritance value of $18,000. Below her name were 5 other current residents, including Mrs. Brennan herself, with similar notations and financial estimates. Next to Mrs. Brennan's own name, someone had written, "Potentially problematic due to intelligence and observational skills, may require special handling." The discovery that she was already marked for death sent terror through Mrs. Brennan that nearly paralyzed her ability to think rationally. But beneath fear was burning determination to expose truth and save her fellow residents' lives. She carefully photographed the most important documents in her memory, then returned everything to its exact position before relocking the office door. Among the most chilling discoveries in O'Brien's files were letters revealing the true operation scope. O'Brien had been in contact with similar charitable institutions in Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore, sharing methods and even referring wealthy widows between cities when circumstances required moving victims. The Murder for Inheritance network stretched across multiple states and had operated for nearly a decade. One letter dated just 2 months earlier described the retirement of a Philadelphia operation after certain complications arose with local authorities. The writer, signing herself as Sister Margaret, advised O'Brien to be prepared to close the current enterprise and relocate if necessary, providing detailed instructions for destroying evidence and disposing of problematic assets. Mrs. Brennan also found records indicating the home's sterling reputation had been carefully cultivated through strategic charitable donations and social connections. O'Brien had contributed substantial sums to various churches and charitable organizations throughout the city, using money stolen from murdered residents to build credibility, allowing continued operation. She had also cultivated relationships with prominent New York society members, hosting tea parties and charitable events showcasing the home's apparently exemplary work. The financial records revealed the operation's staggering profitability. After expenses for maintaining the building, paying legitimate staff members unaware of murders, and making charitable contributions necessary to maintain reputation, the three conspirators had accumulated personal wealth exceeding $100,000 each. They had invested much of this money in legitimate businesses and property throughout the city, creating the appearance of successful charitable administrators while building substantial personal fortunes. Armed with this horrifying evidence, Mrs. Brennan faced an impossible dilemma growing more urgent each passing day. She could not simply leave the home. Residents attempting early departure were always convinced to stay through various means, and those insisting on leaving often fell mysteriously ill within days and died before completing departure. She had witnessed this pattern with Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who had announced intention to move in with a distant cousin in Boston, but suffered sudden health decline preventing departure and leading to death within a week. Going to authorities presented its own challenges. The Blessed Widow's Christian home enjoyed impeccable community reputation, endorsed by prominent churches and supported by wealthy benefactors who would find accusations against such respected institution difficult to believe. O'Brien was personally acquainted with several city officials and had cultivated relationships with influential New York society members who would likely dismiss accusations as ravings of a confused elderly woman. More immediately threatening was realization her own investigations had not gone unnoticed. Catherine Kelly had begun paying unusual attention to her daily activities, appearing at unexpected moments and asking pointed questions about sleep patterns, appetite, and overall health. The conversations were conducted with Kelly's usual professional demeanor, but underlying assessment quality made Mrs. Brennan feel like a specimen being evaluated for some unspecified purpose. "You've seemed a bit restless lately, dear," Kelly observed one morning while distributing medications to residents. "Are you sleeping well? I've noticed you moving about hallways at night, and I'm concerned you might be experiencing some discomfort interfering with your rest." Father Walsh too had begun scheduling regular counseling sessions with Mrs. Brennan, despite her attempts to decline his spiritual guidance offers. The sessions followed a pattern she now recognized as preparation for the murder process's final phase. Walsh spoke frequently about spiritual preparation for death, importance of ensuring one's earthly affairs properly arranged, and peace from releasing attachment to worldly possessions. "I sense you carry some burden troubling your spirit," Walsh would say during these sessions, his voice filled with apparent compassion. "Many women your age find themselves wrestling with questions about remaining years' meaning and proper disposition of worldly goods accumulated. These concerns are natural, but they can become spiritual obstacles if we allow them to consume thoughts." Most alarmingly, O'Brien herself had begun making casual inquiries about Mrs. Brennan's financial situation and family connections. During what appeared friendly conversations over meals or in the sitting room, she would ask about distant relatives, investment accounts, and any legal arrangements Mrs. Brennan might have made for disposing of her modest estate. "I hope you won't think me presumptuous," O'Brien said during one such conversation, "but I've noticed you never receive correspondence from family members and you've never mentioned having legal representation for your affairs. As women age, it becomes increasingly important to ensure their interests are properly protected. I would be happy to recommend attorneys specializing in elder law and estate planning." Mrs. Brennan realized she was being evaluated and prepared for murder with the same methodical approach used on all previous victims. The process was so refined, so perfectly disguised as caring attention to her welfare, she might never have recognized it if she hadn't discovered truth about the home's operations. Her situation became even more precarious when she began suspecting her food and medications might already be tampered with. She noticed her evening meals sometimes had slightly bitter aftertaste she hadn't experienced before, and the herbal tea Kelly insisted she drink for her arthritis often left her feeling drowsy and disoriented in ways inconsistent with supposed ingredients. When she discreetly disposed of these items instead of consuming them, her sleep improved dramatically and thinking became clearer, changes suggesting she had indeed been receiving small laudanum doses designed to make her more compliant and easier to manipulate. The crisis reached its peak on the night of May 3, 1848, when Mrs. Brennan was awakened by soft footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Through her keyhole, she could see Catherine Kelly moving silently through the hallway, carrying a small medical bag and a lantern turned down to its lowest setting. Kelly's movements had the deliberate quality of someone performing a familiar routine, and her destination was clearly predetermined. Kelly stopped at Mrs. Patterson's door and quietly worked the lock open with what appeared a master key. Mrs. Brennan watched in horror as Kelly disappeared into Mrs. Patterson's room, knowing she was witnessing the final act of a murder planned for weeks. For nearly 20 minutes, Kelly remained in Mrs. Patterson's room while Mrs. Brennan struggled with the terrible decision of whether to intervene. She knew confronting Kelly directly would likely result in her own immediate murder, but she also knew remaining silent would make her complicit in Mrs. Patterson's death. When Kelly finally emerged, she was no longer carrying the medical bag, and her movements had a satisfied businesslike quality chilling Mrs. Brennan to the bone. Kelly locked Mrs. Patterson's door behind her and disappeared down the corridor toward her own quarters, apparently confident her work was complete. Mrs. Brennan knew that by morning, Mrs. Patterson would be found dead in bed, another victim of the home's systematic murder operation. The thought of watching another innocent woman die while she remained safe in her own room was unbearable. Unable to witness another murder without action, Mrs. Brennan made a decision she knew might cost her own life but represented the only chance to save Mrs. Patterson and potentially expose the entire operation. As soon as Kelly's footsteps faded, she crept from her room and moved carefully toward Mrs. Patterson's door. The lock Kelly had key-opened was now secured again. But Mrs. Brennan's childhood lock-picking experience served her well in this desperate moment. Working as quietly as possible with a hairpin, she managed to open the door and slip into Mrs. Patterson's room. What she found confirmed worst fears. Mrs. Patterson was unconscious but still breathing, lying in bed with an empty medicine glass on her bedside table smelling strongly of laudanum mixed with something else, possibly chloral hydrate or another sedative Kelly had added to ensure fatal outcome. The elderly woman's breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had grayish pallor suggesting poison was already working to shut down vital systems. Working quickly and as quietly as possible, Mrs. Brennan managed to rouse Mrs. Patterson enough to make her vomit most of the poison she had been given. It was a desperate measure that might not work, but it was the only intervention she could attempt without medical training or proper antidotes. For the next several hours, she sat with the semi-conscious woman, helping her drink small water sips to flush remaining poison from her system and keeping her awake to prevent slipping into the final coma Kelly had intended. It was a terrifying vigil, conducted in near-total darkness, with constant fear Kelly might return to check on her victim. By dawn, Mrs. Patterson was weak but alert, and she listened with growing horror as Mrs. Brennan explained what had nearly happened to her and what had definitely happened to other residents dying at the home. "They were going to kill me," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice hoarse from poison effects and forced vomiting. "But why? I've done nothing to harm anyone. I've been nothing but grateful for their care." Mrs. Brennan showed her the gathered evidence, the copied note from O'Brien's ledgers, the systematic operation details, and specific plans made for Mrs. Patterson's murder and inheritance theft. "It's about your money," Mrs. Brennan explained grimly. "They've been murdering wealthy widows and stealing estates for years. You were supposed to die tonight, and by tomorrow they would have buried you and claimed your entire inheritance as charitable donation to the home." The realization that trust had been so completely betrayed left Mrs. Patterson shaken and terrified, but it also filled her with determination to ensure no other women suffered the same fate. Together, they developed a desperate plan offering their only chance of exposing murders and escaping with lives. Mrs. Patterson would continue pretending unconsciousness while Mrs. Brennan slipped out to contact authorities, but both knew convincing police to investigate such respected institution would require more evidence than copied notes and two elderly women's testimony. As sun rose on May 4, 1848, Mrs. Brennan made her way through empty Manhattan streets toward Detective Inspector Thomas Fitzgerald's office, one of the few police officials she believed might take accusations seriously. Fitzgerald had built a reputation on several high-profile cases involving crimes against elderly and vulnerable citizens, and his willingness to investigate cases other officers might dismiss had made him both respected and controversial within the police department. Fitzgerald's office was in a narrow building near City Hall, up 3 flights of stairs, leaving Mrs. Brennan breathless and dizzy by the time she reached his door. The detective was a man in his early 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, suggesting both skepticism and compassion, qualities Mrs. Brennan hoped would serve her well in this desperate situation. Initially, Fitzgerald was politely skeptical of Mrs. Brennan's accusations. The Blessed Widows Christian Home was well known to him as a respectable charitable institution, and the idea it could be operating as front for systematic murder seemed almost impossible to believe. "Mrs. Brennan," he said gently, "I understand you're concerned about fellow residents, but what you're describing would represent one of the most extensive criminal operations in city history. Are you certain you haven't misunderstood some of what you've observed?" But as Mrs. Brennan presented gathered evidence, forged document specifics, systematic death and inheritance patterns, and carefully documented future murder plans, Fitzgerald's skepticism began giving way to professional interest. The turning point came when Mrs. Brennan provided specific information about financial accounts holding stolen money and lawyers' names used to process fraudulent wills. This information was too detailed and specific to be confusion or delusion product, and it suggested record access an ordinary resident would never have seen. "If what you're telling me is true," Fitzgerald said, leaning forward in his chair, "then we're dealing with conspiracy going far beyond simple theft. These people have committed multiple murders, and they're planning more." But Fitzgerald also recognized investigation challenges with such well-respected institution. Any direct confrontation with O'Brien and associates would give them time to destroy evidence and potentially flee the city. He needed enough proof to make arrests and secure convictions before conspirators realized they had been discovered. The detective's plan was both bold and risky. Rather than conducting obvious investigation alerting conspirators, he would place the home under discreet surveillance while using his legal and financial community contacts to verify Mrs. Brennan's provided information. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brennan would return home and continue acting as if nothing had changed while gathering any additional evidence she could safely access. It was a dangerous game requiring her to continue living among people who had already marked her for death, but it represented their best chance of building case strong enough to ensure convictions. The plan nearly collapsed immediately when Mrs. Brennan returned home to find Catherine Kelly waiting in entrance hall with concerned authority expression. "Mrs. Brennan, wherever have you been?" Kelly asked, tone suggesting both worry and suspicion. "When you weren't in your room this morning, we were quite concerned you might have had some sort of episode. Mrs. Patterson has taken quite ill during the night, and we were hoping you might have information about her condition since you're such close friends." The mention of Mrs. Patterson sent chill through Mrs. Brennan, but she maintained composure and provided carefully prepared explanation for absence. "I woke early with terrible arthritis pain and decided to walk to market for fresh air," she said, forcing voice steady. "I didn't want to disturb anyone moving about hallways, so I let myself out quietly. I'm sorry if I caused any worry." Kelly's response suggested Mrs. Brennan's explanation was accepted, but something in the woman's eyes indicated increased suspicion and attention. "Well, you must be careful about going out alone, especially so early morning," Kelly said. "At your age, a fall or sudden illness could be quite serious. Perhaps in future, you could ask assistance if you need to go out for any reason." The conversation was polite and apparently caring, but Mrs. Brennan understood she was being told in most diplomatic terms possible that her movements would now be more closely monitored. Over following 2 weeks, Detective Fitzgerald's investigation began confirming most horrifying aspects of Mrs. Brennan's accusations. His banking community contacts verified the Blessed Widows Christian Home had indeed received substantial deposits following numerous resident deaths, amounts far exceeding ordinary charitable donation expectations. The lawyers processing many wills reported documents had been presented by Margaret O'Brien herself, claiming to act as executrix for deceased clients. While wills appeared properly executed, several attorneys now admitted finding certain transaction aspects unusual, particularly settlement speed and lack of any family members challenging distributions. Most damning was discovery that death certificates for many deceased residents had been signed by Dr. Edmund Morrison, a physician losing medical license 3 years earlier for falsifying death certificates in exchange for money. Morrison had been operating illegally ever since, providing fraudulent medical services to anyone willing to pay fees. When confronted by Detective Fitzgerald, Dr. Morrison initially denied any involvement with the Blessed Widow's Christian Home. But faced with evidence of his signature on multiple death certificates and practicing medicine without license prosecution threat, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Morrison's confession revealed murder execution medical details. Catherine Kelly would administer increasing laudanum doses to selected residents over weeks, building tolerance while creating documented medical need for medication. When final murder time came, she would give massive overdose mixed with chloral hydrate, creating what appeared peaceful death from heart failure or respiratory depression. The woman knew exactly what she was doing, Morrison told Fitzgerald during confession. She understood dosages, drug interactions, and how to make murder look like natural death. I've seen trained physicians with less pharmacology knowledge. Morrison also revealed he had been providing death certificates for similar operations in other cities, suggesting the murder for inheritance network was even more extensive than previously suspected. His records indicated fraudulent death certificates for operations in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Richmond, representing potentially hundreds of elderly victims over past decade. But while Fitzgerald's investigation built strong case against conspirators, situation inside Blessed Widow's Christian Home was becoming increasingly dangerous for both Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson. Kelly's suspicions about Mrs. Brennan's behavior continued growing, and O'Brien had begun making more direct inquiries about both women's estate planning and family connections. The crisis culminated on May 18 when Mrs. Patterson was summoned to O'Brien's office for what was described as routine discussion about future care needs. Mrs. Brennan knew such meetings had preceded previous victims' deaths, and she feared conspirators had decided to accelerate timeline due to growing suspicions. Detective Fitzgerald had planned waiting another week before taking action against conspirators, hoping additional evidence would ensure multiple murder convictions. But Mrs. Brennan's urgent message, delivered by a young boy she had paid to carry note to his office, convinced him immediate intervention was necessary to prevent additional murders. On afternoon of May 18, 1848, Fitzgerald arrived at Blessed Widow's Christian Home with 4 other officers and warrants for Margaret O'Brien, Catherine Kelly, and Father Patrick Walsh's arrest on conspiracy to commit murder charges. He had timed arrests to coincide with regular afternoon sitting room gathering, when all residents and staff would be present, and conspirators would have no opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. But when officers entered building, they found O'Brien prepared for arrival with composure, suggesting she had been expecting this moment. "Detective Fitzgerald," she said calmly, rising from sitting room chair where she had been reading to several residents. "What brings you to our humble home? I hope there hasn't been some misunderstanding requiring police intervention." The other residents looked on in confusion and growing alarm as Fitzgerald presented arrest warrants and explained charges against the 3 staff members. Several women began weeping, unable to comprehend that people they had trusted with lives were accused of systematic murder. Margaret O'Brien maintained dignity and composure even as handcuffs were placed on wrists. "I'm afraid there has been terrible mistake," she said, voice filled with apparent sadness rather than anger. "Someone has obviously filled your mind with lies about our charitable work here. I pray truth will eventually come to light and clear our names of these outrageous accusations." Catherine Kelly, by contrast, became hysterical realizing crimes had been discovered. She began screaming accusations at Mrs. Brennan, claiming elderly women had sabotaged their work and destroyed mission of caring for vulnerable widows. "She's the one you should be arresting," Kelly shrieked as officers restrained her. "She's been poisoning our residents' minds with paranoid fantasies. We've done nothing but provide Christian care for these women, and this is how we're repaid." Father Walsh attempted maintaining clerical dignity, but his youth and obvious terror made protests unconvincing. "There must be some mistake," he said repeatedly. "I'm a man of God, sworn to serve others. I would never harm anyone, especially not vulnerable women in our care." But most dramatic moment came when officers searched O'Brien's office and discovered hidden chamber behind false wall. The document, ledger, and correspondence collection Mrs. Brennan had described was exactly where she had said it would be, providing irrefutable evidence of systematic crime nature. Even more shocking was discovery that operation had been far more extensive than anyone suspected. The hidden records revealed not 21 murders as visible ledger indicated, but 52 deaths over 5 years since home establishment. Earlier murders had been recorded in separate ledgers documenting method refinement and operation expansion. Financial records showed 3 conspirators had stolen over $700,000 from victims, staggering sum representing one of the largest theft operations in American history. They had used this money to establish legitimate businesses, purchase real estate, and create appearance of successful charitable administrators while systematically murdering women they pretended to serve. But most horrifying discovery came when officers searched building's basement and found evidence of hidden burial chamber that would not be fully excavated until building's demolition 21 years later. Behind what appeared solid foundation wall, they found carefully excavated chamber extending beneath garden behind building. The chamber contained not just recent murder evidence, but systematically organized burial ground with wooden coffins arranged in precise rows. The coffins were numbered and labeled with detailed records beside each grave documenting victim's name, death date, murder method, and stolen estate value. The records revealed operation had been far more methodical and extensive than even Mrs. Brennan had suspected. Each murder had been carefully planned and executed according to refined protocol, minimizing detection risk while maximizing financial return. The conspirators had developed detailed ideal victim profiles, wealthy widows without close family connections who could be isolated and manipulated without raising broader community suspicions. The basement chamber also contained evidence of similar operations network in other cities. Correspondence with charitable institutions in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Richmond revealed coordinated murder for inheritance scheme system operating for over a decade. Most chilling were personal effects stored with each body. Jewelry, photographs, letters, and other mementos victims had treasured as last connections to previous lives. These items had been carefully catalogued and stored, apparently as successful murder trophies rather than simple theft. The trial of Margaret O'Brien, Catherine Kelly, and Patrick Walsh became one of New York City's most sensational criminal cases, attracting nationwide attention and exposing elderly women's vulnerability in society, providing few legal protections. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Price, presented case documenting not just murders committed at Blessed Widows Christian Home but entire similar operations network preying on vulnerable elderly women throughout eastern United States. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Medical experts testified about sophisticated methods used to administer fatal laudanum and other drug doses while making deaths appear natural. Legal experts explained how fraudulent wills had been created and executed, often while victims were sedated and unable to understand what they signed. Financial experts detailed complex account and investment system conspirators had used to hide stolen wealth while building legitimate businesses, providing cover for criminal operations. But perhaps most powerful testimony came from survivors Mrs. Sarah Brennan and Mrs. Patterson, whose courage and persistence had exposed murders and saved countless future victims. Mrs. Brennan's testimony, delivered over 3 days, provided detailed account of how she had discovered truth about Holmes' operations and desperate measures taken to save Mrs. Patterson's life and expose crimes. Her careful observed pattern documentation and gathered evidence provided foundation for prosecution's case. Mrs. Patterson's near-murder testimony was equally compelling. She described trust placed in caregivers and horror realizing they had been planning her death while pretending care for welfare. "I gave them my trust, my money, and nearly my life," she said during testimony. "They smiled at me, prayed with me, and spoke of Christian charity while planning to murder me for inheritance. If not for Mrs. Brennan's courage, I would be dead and buried in that basement chamber with all other women who trusted them with lives." The defense attempted arguing deaths had been natural and any financial irregularities simply poor record-keeping rather than systematic theft evidence. They portrayed O'Brien as dedicated charitable worker overwhelmed by complex elderly care demands, and suggested accusations were paranoid fantasy results from confused elderly residents. But physical evidence was overwhelming. The basement burial chamber's systematic organization, detailed planned murder records, and sophisticated financial operations all pointed to premeditation and organization level, making innocence claims impossible to maintain. The revelation of defendants' true identities during trial added horror layer to case. Margaret O'Brien was revealed as Elizabeth Morrison, former nurse suspected in series of suspicious deaths at Philadelphia and Boston hospitals. She had developed scheme after observing how easily elderly patients could be manipulated into changing wills and how rarely such deaths were investigated when occurring in respected institutions. Catherine Kelly was actually Margaret Collins, former morgue attendant dismissed from previous position for stealing from dead. Her body handling and drug administration expertise had made her ideal operation partner, providing medical knowledge necessary for undetectable murders. Father Patrick Walsh was revealed as James Murphy, former actor never receiving any religious training but possessing charisma and confidence necessary for convincing vulnerable women to trust him with spiritual and financial affairs. His supposed ordination was completely fraudulent, supported by forged documents and false references. The post-arrest investigation revealed true murder-for-inheritance network scope operating throughout eastern United States. Multiple city police departments began investigating similar charitable institutions, leading to additional arrests and hundreds more murders exposure. In Philadelphia, St. Catherine's Home for Elderly Women was revealed as another systematic murder front with over 30 victims discovered in hidden basement chamber similar to New York's. The operation had been run by Elizabeth Morrison before moving to New York and establishing Blessed Widows Christian Home. Boston authorities uncovered evidence of similar operation at Mercy House for widowed ladies, while Baltimore police discovered Christian Sanctuary for elder women had been murdering residents for over 8 years before closing suddenly when local suspicions grew. The total victims across all connected operations was estimated exceeding 200 women, making it one of most extensive serial murder cases in American history. The stolen money was calculated at over $2 million, enormous 1840 sum representing hundreds of elderly women's life savings. The network exposure led to significant changes in how charitable institutions were regulated and monitored. New laws required regular facility inspections, staff background checks, and legal protections for elderly residents wishing to change living arrangements. The trial concluded with multiple murder, conspiracy, fraud, and theft convictions. Evidence was so overwhelming that jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Margaret O'Brien was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence carried out on October 15, 1849, before thousands gathered to witness execution of one of America's most notorious female criminals. She maintained innocence until end, claiming wrongful accusation for others' crimes. Catherine Kelly received life imprisonment and was sent to Auburn State Prison where she died of tuberculosis in 1863. She spent final years writing detailed confessions revealing additional murders and providing information solving cold cases in multiple states. Patrick Walsh was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment but died of pneumonia after serving only 6 years. His death was attributed to harsh prison conditions and inability adapting to incarceration's physical demands. The Blessed Widows Christian Home was closed immediately after arrests and building sold to private owners who converted it back to residence. But building's dark history made selling difficult, and it changed hands multiple times before finally demolished in 1869. The demolition revealed additional crime evidence, including basement burial chambers' full extent and personal effects hidden throughout building. The discovery of 52 complete remain sets confirmed murder scope and provided closure for families wondering about elderly relatives' fates. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, whose courage and persistence had exposed murders, became celebrated figure in elderly rights and institutional reform movement. She used her experience advocating for stronger vulnerable elderly women protections and better charitable institution oversight. She lived another 15 years after trial, working with legislators drafting new laws protecting charitable institution elderly residents. Her efforts led to regular inspection requirements, mandatory staff background checks, and legal protections for residents wishing to leave such facilities. Mrs. Brennan also worked with Detective Fitzgerald investigating other suspicious regional charitable institutions, helping prevent additional murders and expose fraud in several other cases. Her institutional abuse warning sign recognition expertise made her valuable consultant for law enforcement dealing with similar cases. Mrs. Patterson fully recovered from near-death experience and used saved inheritance, establishing legitimate charitable foundation providing widows assistance throughout city. The Patterson Foundation, as it became known, offered both financial assistance and legal advocacy for elderly women finding themselves vulnerable to exploitation. The foundation also established First Shelter specifically designed protecting elderly women from financial predators and abusive family members. The shelter provided temporary housing, legal assistance, and advocacy services for women needing protection while organizing affairs or finding safe permanent housing. Both women remained close friends for rest of lives, bonded by shared experience surviving one of America's most horrifying criminal conspiracies. They continued speaking publicly about experience, using their story educating others about institutional abuse warning signs and maintaining outside world connections' importance. The Blessed Widows Christian Home case profoundly impacted American society's understanding of elderly women's vulnerability and legal protections needed against exploitation. The murder's systematic nature and sophisticated concealment methods revealed how easily trust could be exploited when combined with social isolation and limited legal protections. The case also highlighted widows' particular vulnerability in 19th-century America, where women had few legal rights and limited independent living options after husband's death. The murders demonstrated how criminals understanding social and legal systems leaving elderly women defenseless could exploit these vulnerabilities. The public outrage case generated led to significant reforms in charitable institution regulation and monitoring. New laws required regular inspections, employee background checks, and legal protections for residents wishing to change living arrangements or complain about treatment. The case also led to inheritance law and estate planning changes with new independent will verification requirements and additional fraud protections. These changes made stealing inheritances through coercion or fraud much more difficult for criminals. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated the importance of maintaining social connections and outside oversight for vulnerable elderly individuals. The isolation making victims easy targets also prevented outside intervention that might have saved their lives. Do you think something like this horrifying operation could happen in today's world? Or have our legal protections and oversight systems evolved enough to prevent such systematic murder? The Blessed Widows Christian Home story reminds us that evil often wears charity's mask and that vigilance is safety's price for society's most vulnerable members. Just when we thought horror in this Manhattan home couldn't worsen, the Uncovered Network's full scope revealed conspiracy stretching across multiple states and claiming hundreds of lives. If this story has given you chills, share this video with someone appreciating dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button supporting our investigation into America's forgotten crimes. And subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. The 52 women buried in that basement chamber had trusted caregivers with lives and fortunes, never suspecting their Christian charity was actually a sophisticated operation designed to rob and murder them. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that most heinous crimes can hide behind respectability and religious devotion facades. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe proper oversight could have prevented these murders, or were 1840s social conditions too different from today for adequate protection? Share theories in comments below, and let us know if you'd like hearing more stories about America's darkest historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that past holds secrets still capable of shocking us today, and that justice, even when delayed, can still provide closure for forgotten victims of history's most calculating killers.